One of the most popular figures in human history is no doubt the Islamic figure Muhammad. His life and his testimony has inspired countless people all across the globe to follow in his footsteps and adhere to the precepts of Islam. So during this influential moment in history, I wanted to take the time to answer what I thought to be an interesting question. What were Africans doing during the life of Muhammad? What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. And as always, if you want to support the Home Team, you could do so on patreon.com. I have some new rewards for you guys, so be sure to check that out. Also, go to Afrographics.com, a website where you can find unique illustrative infographics summarizing African history. All links to Patreon, Afrographics, and Home Team merchandise are in the description box below. It's interesting to note that Muhammad himself was not at all ignorant of African people. In fact, one of his closest companions was an African named Bilal. Bilal was an enslaved African who was said to be the most trusted and loyal companion of Muhammad. His mother was said to be an Ethiopian woman who was captured and enslaved, and Bilal lived his life with that weight. But he later became one of the most prominent figures in the religion, and Muhammad himself seemed to have respected him. Given that early encounter with an African during his lifetime, what else were Africans doing on the continent itself? Well, Muhammad was said to have existed in the 6th and 7th centuries, and so that's a time period we'll be discussing concerning the history of the African continent. I'm going to be touching on 5 different regions in Africa, so that we can hopefully get a full picture of what was going on during this time. Let's begin with North Africa. North Africa during the life of Muhammad was under the control of the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine imperial control of North Africa, which lasted from 533 to about 700 AD, will forever be associated with Justinian the Great. We know that Byzantine North Africa centered on the territories that today comprise Tunisia, the eastern part of Algeria, and western Libya, and that it was subdivided into 6 provinces, each under a governor. At this time, Byzantine Carthage, with a population of around 10,000, was perhaps the largest city in all of Africa. Even though the Byzantines controlled much of North Africa, they had a very contentious social relationship with the local Berber population, having to put off various insurrections by tribal chieftains. Beyond the coastal North African plain, Byzantine power depended on shaky alliances with the leaders of friendly Berber tribes, who in return for cash payments intermittently undertook the collection of taxes and assisted in maintaining Byzantine rule. In essence, the Berbers were never fully under Byzantine control. However, even though there continued to be raiding by Berber tribes, the impression gained from the chronicles and sources is that the period from 564 to about the 640s, the key moment of Muhammad's life, was one of relative stability and prosperity for Byzantine North Africa. Next, we'll touch on Central Africa. One of the primary things happening during the life of Muhammad in Central Africa was the rise of the Zagawa people and the beginning stages for the formation of one of Africa's greatest empires, Kanem. But before the state of Kanem could form, the Sao people had to be conquered and dealt with. The later empire of Kanem absorbed the kingdom of the Sao people, and the people of Kanem borrowed many aspects of their civilization. During the life of Muhammad, the Sao people were developing their culture and constructing cities and towns. The Sao developed sculptures, coins, statues, and other artworks using iron, bronze, and copper. The historian Caroline Afeka provides the following description of the Sao peoples. The Sao people possessed considerable political and artistic genius. They developed city-states which were the centers of local patriotism. Each city was surrounded by strong defensive walls and dominated the life of the surrounding countryside, which it both protected and governed. Government was by an elaborate hierarchy, headed by a divine ruler. Except on ceremonial occasions, the rulers made few public appearances, and even they remained concealed from the common gaze by a screen. Women occupied a respected position in society, and the queen mother and senior sister of the ruler exercised considerable political influence on the government of the state. The Sao people were mainly settled farmers, but among them were craftsmen of considerable industrial and artistic merit. They were able to work in both clay and metal, to manufacture household utensils, tools, and works of art for religious purposes. Impressive objects found by archaeologists include burial urns and figures of animals and human beings, both in clay and bronze. All this had been achieved before about 700 AD. So according to Caroline Efeka, the Sao people of Central Africa had developed an impressive civilization during the life and times of Muhammad. Now, let's go to West Africa. During the life of Muhammad, the very first empire in Africa was beginning to take form. The kingdom of Wagadu was believed to have been founded by the Soninka people in around the 4th century, but it later expanded and became an empire around the 7th century, a pivotal time concerning the developments of Muhammad's legacy. The first recognized king of Wagadu was said to be Kaya Magan Sise, who lived around 350 CE. He was the founder of the Sise royal dynasty that dominated Wagadu well into the 8th century. The Sise family continued to be a strong presence in the later history of African kingdoms. Wagadu was said to have had powerful cities, frequently referred to in literature as twin cities or towns. One of these great cities having domed buildings and thickets where the Soninka priests were centered. Much later, an Arab traveler named al-Bukhari questioned merchants who visited Wagadu in the 11th century, and this is what he wrote about the Wagadu king. He sits in audience or to hear grievances against officials in a domed pavilion around which stand 10 horses covered with gold embroidered materials. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the kings of his country wearing splendid garments and their hair plaited with gold. The governor of the city sits on the ground before the king, and around him are ministers seated likewise. At the door of the pavilion are dogs of excellent pedigree that hardly ever leave the place where the king is, guarding him. Around their necks they wear collars of gold and silver studded with a number of balls of the same metals. During the life of Muhammad, Wagadu was a flourishing empire that had a monopoly on the gold trade in the region, giving the Sise dynasty and the Wagadu state access to much wealth and power. In Eastern Africa during the life of Muhammad, various Christian kingdoms were thriving, becoming a prominent force in the region. In the mid-6th century, a number of ecclesiastical historians wrote of the conversion of the inhabitants of Nubia, thus informing us of the existence of 3 kingdoms in that region. The kingdom Nobadia lay closest to Egypt. Beyond the 3rd cataract was the kingdom of Makuria, and to the south of the 5th cataract lay the kingdom of Awa. Right before the advent of Muhammad, as part of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian's plans to regain control of the former territory and extend his borders, proselytizing missions were dispatched to Nubia, or the Sudan region today. The royal family of Makuria was converted to Christianity in 570, in the same year as Muhammad's birth, and the kingdom of Awa was converted in 580. Nobadia had been converted even earlier. Hostilities between the kingdoms of Nubia are reported in the accounts of these missionary missions. It appears that while Nobadia and Awa enjoyed cordial relations, they were both at odds with Makuria. In the 7th century, the Christian church in the Nubian kingdoms became aligned predominantly with the Coptic church, thus strengthening relations with Egypt. The kingdom of Makuria eventually became the dominant Christian kingdom in the region around the 7th century. In 573, a Makurian delegation arrived in Constantinople, offering ivory and a giraffe and declaring its good relationship with the Byzantines. The early ecclesiastical architecture at Dungalo, Makuria's capital, confirms the close relationship they maintained with the Byzantines, and during this time, trade continued to flourish between them. After the death of Muhammad, the Makurians became a very powerful Christian Nubian kingdom and ousted several attempts by the Arabs to conquer the region militarily, most notably their defeat at the hands of the Nubians at the Battle of Dungalo, leading the Arabs to agree to a treaty. And finally, in Ethiopia, during the time of Muhammad, the kingdom of Aksum was in its later stages. The civilization of Aksum lasted for the first 1,000 years of the Christian era. Aksum was a major power of the Red Sea region. It had extensive commercial, diplomatic, and cultural contacts with the Hellenistic and Indian Ocean world, and they were well known as one of the world powers in their time. They had a formidable navy, and during the time of King Caleb in the 6th century, the Aksumites sent an expedition to Yemen to repress an uprising against their rule. This event made the Aksumites the first empire south of the Sahara to extend its borders outside of the African continent. Also, in the 6th century, glazed pottery was imported from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and bowls from North Africa. Aksum remained powerful until the 7th century, when its trading power was weakened by both Persia and later the rise of Islam. However, environmental degradation may have also played a role in the weakening of Aksum in the northern Ethiopian highlands. As Aksum disintegrated, its agricultural peoples found themselves increasingly isolated from the Eurasian core of Christianity, which had some consequences for the region. Even though Aksum was declining during the time of Muhammad, both Christianity and Semitic culture continued to flourish. In the centuries that followed the declining of the Aksumite state, the Christian polity incorporated the Agwa-speaking peoples, particularly those from the area of Lasta. Evolving as part of the political and military elite, the Agwa speakers of Lasta seized control of the kingdom in the middle of the 12th century, establishing what was later to become known as the Zagwe dynasty. Well, I'm Ola, guys. Hopefully you learned something about Africa during the life and times of Muhammad. If you like these videos and want to help out in its continued production, you can do so on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.